Hi, welcome back to Random Reading Pathways. I'm Matt, and today I wanted to do, for the first time on this channel, something I hope to make a little bit of a series out of, which would be further looks at books that I've read. And this one being the most recent book I've read, China by Alan Wall. So I read this recently, and I did talk about it a little bit in a previous video, but I think it was a tag video. So I didn't really have a great chance to go into some more detail with this. And since I finished this, I was able to reflect more on it and flip back through it a little bit more, and even had a chance to apply some color-coded tabs there to this to kind of organize my thoughts about it. So yeah, going forward, when books do seem to have enough, to offer as far as some of the things I like to talk about in more detail, I'd like to feature them in kind of this format. So to help me do that, I kind of came up with 4 sort of bullet points that I'll go through here, and hopefully if future books meet these kind of criteria, then I'd like to, use it as a template to talk about more books. So starting with number 1, the first sort of element that I'd like to talk about in more detail is more general. It's just scene or passage or theme of note. So just kind of like a larger 30,000 foot view of, what's sort of my favorite thing about this book that I took away. It could be language, it could be specific passages, or just like a theme that's in the book that really resonated with me the most. So for this one, I mentioned this a little bit when I talked about the book in a previous video, but it would be sort of the musical discussion that's in the book. So the main character, Digby, who inherited a fine china business and ran it for years, but then at the time the book comes around, he's elderly already, so he's sort of not in the game anymore, so to speak. But his son, Theo, is a jazz trumpeter, and he features in the book quite a bit. He's probably like the other main character, I would say. And there's a lot of great discussion in the book about his jazz trumpet playing. You get some very interesting scenes of him with his bandmates, playing some clubs. And, I'm a huge music fan, so anything musical in a book, like whether it's fiction or nonfiction, it's always going to just elevate it a little bit further for me. As far as jazz music specifically, it's something I'm trying to explore deeper. I kind of have tried to explore it and find some artists that I'm a fan of, and find some styles that I'm a particular fan of. I have like a Spotify jazz music playlist that I've started putting together, which I find myself revisiting pretty often. But yeah, I thought the description of the jazz music portion of this book was really interesting to me, and especially poignant because there's a constant kind of conflict in this story regarding Theo, having to do with sort of internal demons that he has, and they're preventing him from realizing what is obviously a very strong musical potential. So there's a lot of commentary from both the author and other characters in the book as to Theo's exquisite abilities when it comes to jazz trumpeting. He's compared to Miles Davis, and but the problem is he's going down these roads in the book that are not good for him, and they're preventing him from realizing that potential. So it was a little bit of like a beautiful to read about his playing the way it was described, but tragic in the sense that it never really was able to be fully realized. So kind of what I'm trying to do here is, use these tabs to sort of color code and just point out some cool language about this. I'll try to keep this general because, quite frankly, when it comes to, quoting from a book on here, I don't 100% know the, contours of what's allowed with that. If anybody has any further detailed knowledge about what's okay and what's not, I'd be happy to learn that from you. But I just highlighted a few areas in here where the jazz music is sort of highlighted, and really, I enjoyed reading it. So there's one in here talking about Theo's initial love for jazz music and how he came to it, and it's talking about how he always enjoyed the unprovided for, the unforeseen, extempore, with no premeditation, out of time, with no saving for the future and no malice aforethought, dancing even as it goes down, giving you the song by pointing to its absences. So I enjoyed that language on jazz music, and kind of tying it into how Theo came to that genre. And there's a further one here that I flagged, which I thought tied right into my kind of mindset with this channel, and had to be pointed out. So again, this one actually is an excerpt from throughout the book. Theo does these voice recordings on his dictaphone at times to record his thoughts, and also record what he hopes to be kind of a message to deliver to his father, because they have a very strained relationship that is really at odds with each other. So this is a part of that, and he's talking about how his father asked him about jazz and what brings him to it, what keeps him so tied to it. And, he concludes it by saying, "I think maybe what I like about it, Dad, is that you can't work out everything beforehand. One unexpected harmony, one individual chorus might just alter everything. It never abandons the random. It rides the wave." So not hard to point out, for me, why that language resonated with me given this channel. But yeah, so the theme of musicality and jazz music tied right into the randomness and riding the wave, which is something I fully subscribe to. So yeah, wanted to just highlight a couple of those little points from the book as sort of part one of this discussion, kind of a theme of note for me. Part two, I have listed as kind of favorite side or secondary character, favorite minor character. I think at times, like if there's a primary fascinating main character that really drives the book, I'll focus on them. But to the extent that kind of a kind of a quirky little unheralded sort of side character steals a lot of the scenes in a book, or kind of has an extra impact on me, I like to point those characters out, because a lot of times looking back on books, I'll remember certain side characters and find that they really add a lot of extra flavor to the book. So in this one, so Digby is elderly, he's retired, he's not involved in the China business anymore, but he's sort of a shut-in and doesn't really interact with many people. But one that he does interact with regularly, who's in the book quite a bit, is his neighbor Daisy, who's also an old retiree. And her kind of quest at the moment in this book that she kind of draws Digby into is trying to find, and it's actually parallels Digby quite a bit with his relationship with his son, but she's trying to sort of find out what her son is doing, because she gets little bits and pieces of information about what he's doing, and comes to learn that he's running this website online called Radix, and she stumbles across posts that he puts on this website, and her son's name is Howard, and Howard is the character I'm featuring here, because he is not in the book physically, like at the large majority of it. So you don't actually meet him until much, much later toward the end of the book, but you are introduced to him through his mother, Daisy, and she tells Digby about this website he's running, and the website is an anarchist sort of revolutionary type website, so she's very concerned about what he's doing, and it gives the author, Alan Wall, a chance to kind of speak in a different type of voice from some of the other characters when he writes up the passages that Howard, her son, posts on his website. So you'll get occasionally long rants about politics, economics, long rants about sort of government and how it's out to get you, and nothing's fair. And yeah, I mean, this book was written in 2003, and it was kind of at a turbulent time in the world, with sort of 9/11 having been pretty fresh after this still. So there's a lot of that sentiment. There's actually discussion in the book. There is a scene where they do watch the 9/11 footage. So some of the website seems to be a reaction to sort of the aftermath of 9/11 and sort of what's going on in the world at that point. But yeah, I thought Howard was an interesting character. Just if nothing else, just to read his kind of his diatribes that he goes on his website. And then finally, later on, she does come to kind of reunite with him in an unexpected way. And actually, very interestingly, at the very, very tail end of the book, he does finally connect with Digby too in a very unexpected way, which was interesting to see too. So you have kind of these two elderly people who keep each other company in their retirement a little bit, and they have two sons who they're both very concerned or going in the wrong direction in life. And one of them's Howard, who was my favorite minor character, only in the sense that you are introduced to him through his anarchist writings on his website, primarily for the bulk of this book, only to meet him in person later. And it turns out he's able to get along pretty well with anybody. So yeah, he stuck out to me as an interesting minor character. So then the third portion I want to talk about here, and I hope to talk about with more books as I read more into the future, is a connection with another book or another read for me. So for this one, I'll try not to go in too much detail here and try not to do too much in the way of spoilers. But if you don't want something spoiled with this, it's possible this might count as that. But I'll try to keep it broad and generic. So I found sort of a very interesting connection that I really couldn't ignore between something going on in this book and a book that I mentioned in my last video, which I read earlier this year and which currently holds the spot as my favorite book I've read in 2024, and that would be Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire. So to try to tie these together, so there's kind of a theme that's woven into China where Digby, the main character, his great-great-grandfather is Nathaniel Wilton, who is the founder of the company, and the company's called Wilton Bone China. So there's a lot of kind of flashback to his era and his time period in running the company and starting the company, and some of the things that he was up to. And Digby, the character in the book, his great-great-grandson, is also trying to write a book in the book about the history of this company, and a big part of that is his great-great-grandfather who founded it. And there is an interesting part of the research he's doing into his great-great-grandfather, which is his alleged correspondence with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which is a name that I had heard. It was familiar to me, but as far as, in more detail as to who he was, I needed to sort of research that a little bit. So excuse me for looking up here for a moment, but I do have kind of the Wikipedia page up on Samuel Taylor Coleridge just to try to fill this in a little bit in more detail. But Samuel Taylor Coleridge was an English poet, literary critic, philosopher, and theologian who was a founder of the Romantic movement in England and a member of the Lake Poets with his friend William Wordsworth. He wrote the poems The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Kubla Khan, as well as the major prose work Biographia Literaria. His critical works were highly influential, especially in relation to William Shakespeare. So that's kind of who William Taylor Coleridge is, in a quick summary. And what goes on in China is Digby, in doing research into his great-grandfather, discovers that allegedly he was corresponding with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and he was writing him letters. And what's interesting is it's referenced several times in the book. There seems to be no evidence of a response from Coleridge, but it's kind of like the Wilton family in this book through the generations. They have kind of this semi obsession for Coleridge. They have what's called a Coleridge room of some of his artifacts and things, because there's this belief in the family through the generations that Coleridge and Nathaniel Wilton, the great-great-grandfather, corresponded with each other and were sort of, on friendly terms and things like that. But what's interesting is the more you read about that part of this, Digby, as he digs further into this, kind of finds out that it wasn't as mutual as everybody has always thought. So again, I don't want to, go crazy with spoilers or anything. If you don't mind some of that, then please continue with this. But I just flagged a couple parts in the book where there is reference to this sort of this search for the other side of the coin, so to speak. To find evidence of Coleridge responding to Nathaniel Wilton, so that it was a mutual situation. So then here in the book, it talks about, he's talking to Daisy about this alleged correspondence, and he says, "We have copies of Nathaniel's letters, but no one's ever found the poet's replies." And then she responds, "Probably never bothered, too snooty." So that's kind of, you get an intro to, was the Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, was he connected to this Wilton family so strongly as they've believed for so many years, or was he not? And then toward the end, there's a couple more parts here where it comes up. Toward the end, Digby's talking about the book that he's working on, and he's talking about a chapter which is Wilton Bone China in the Age of Coleridge. And here he says, and again, I don't know how permissible it is to quote like a sentence from this, but, I think it's okay. Digby says, "He probably returned to this chapter so often because it was his favorite chapter and the one period of his ancestral company's history for which he could feel unambiguous enthusiasm. But one of the great sorrows of his life had been his inability to trace any mention of Nathaniel Wilton in the life or correspondence of Samuel Taylor Coleridge." So he's, again, talking about how he can't really find evidence that this correspondence was a two-way street. And then finally, there's a chapter near the end when Digby once again talks about sitting down to finish up this book. And he says, when he sat down now to write his final draft, he began with this sentence: "Nathaniel Wilton undoubtedly knew Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Whether Coleridge ever knew Nathaniel Wilton must remain one of history's unanswered questions." So that's kind of the conclusion to the saga of, is there this mutual connection between Coleridge and the Wilton family or not? And that takes me to how this connects to Pale Fire. So if you're not familiar with Pale Fire, basically it's about a poet, John Shade, who writes a poem, Pale Fire. The poem is the middle section of the book, and the majority of the book is commentary on the poem written by John Shade's neighbor and a professor, Charles Kinbote. And one of the most fascinating parts about Pale Fire is the narrator, Kinbote, makes it seem very much, at least in his mind, that he is this big influence on the poet John Shade, that they are great friends, that all the wisdom and things that Kinbote has imparted to John Shade have made an impact on him. And, there's a lot more to the book that, I won't go too detailed into a summary of Pale Fire, but essentially it's a similar type feeling. And when I read that part of China, it jumped out at me because in Pale Fire, Kinbote comes to find out that ultimately that's not so much the case. And he finds that out in reading the poem, Pale Fire, because he knew that John Shade was working on it and he was excited to read it, and he was very sure that he, Kinbote, would be featured in the poem. And he was looking for references to him. He was looking for references to stories that he has told John Shade. And in his commentary, it's one of the funnier parts of the book, but also one of the more tragic parts of the Pale Fire, where he constantly comes up empty. He's constantly kind of scratching his head and saying, I could have sworn that at this point, John Shade would talk about me, and he would reference, what I told him about this. And he didn't. And it just reminded me of this, kind of that unrequited admiration type thing. So the Wilton family in this has this longstanding admiration for Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and they believe that they corresponded with each other. Turns out it was an unrequited situation, and just like Pale Fire. And so when I read that, it just brought all of that rushing back when I read Pale Fire this year, and it's one of the more lasting things in that book, that the big letdown, as it were, of Charles Kinbote, in that it's not a mutual relationship between him and the poet John Shade. So yeah, I don't know if that's a bit of a long-winded roundabout way of like dragging these two books together, but having read them in somewhat close proximity to each other, I just couldn't not comment on the similarity in those two aspects of the stories. And then finally, I move on to the fourth bullet here for kind of, deeper things I want to talk about with books. And this one isn't so much of a deep analysis, but I think this can apply going forward because it's the case for just about every book I read. And I'm calling this part Word I Learned. So China, I thought, was a wonderful use case to do Word I Learned, because I learned a new word probably just about every page of this book. The vocabulary here is pretty extensive, and also UK centric in some parts. So that was its own sort of dialect that I needed to kind of refresh myself on. But for Word I Learned, I just want to kind of pull out a word that featured heavily in the book, or maybe not so heavily, but just made an impact on me. So for China, the word is, and I'm going to pronounce it like this just once. I'm not German, so I'm going to try once the proper pronunciation, and then I'm just going to Americanize it after that. But the word is Wunderkammer. So, and now what I'm going to do for this is just see if I can pull up a couple little Wikipedia excerpts on, now I'm just going to call it Wunderkammer because it's easier for me that way, but I think it should be called Wunderkammer. So in the book, there's a lot of references to a Wunderkammer, and I have my blue posted here, which is sort of like an intro in the book to what this is. So maybe you're familiar with this term. I wasn't. Daisy, the neighbor, turns up to Digby's, and it says, Digby led her for the first time to the room. It's rather beautiful, Digby. What is it? It's my Wunderkammer. You'll have to explain. And so he goes on to tell her what it is, which is basically a room of curiosities. And so with Wikipedia here, I kind of wanted to just highlight, where this comes from. So Wunderkammer, cabinets of curiosities, German, also known as wonder rooms, were encyclopedia collections of objects whose categorical boundaries were, in Renaissance Europe, yet to be defined. The term cabinet originally described a room rather than a piece of furniture. So essentially, it's a room of curiosities. It's a cabinet or a room of collectibles, odds and ends, little memorabilia, little artifacts, and things like that. So here's another entry. Cabinets of curiosities served not only as collections to reflect the particular interests of their curators, but also as social devices to establish and uphold rank in society. So it is basically a room of collections and collectibles. And, I focused on this word because I thought it resonated especially with me, and especially with, I would think, a good portion of other booktubers. We all kind of have our space, I think. We all kind of have hopefully our reading room or our reading space. And more often than not, I think what goes hand in hand with that is sort of a collectible type feeling, and little knickknacks and things that are important to us that we like to put on display and just view and just revisit from time to time. So yeah, in the book, Digby has a Wunderkammer room in his house that is, filled with sort of like artifacts of the business, and, evidence of or examples of china that they had produced. And yeah, it brings him peace. It brings him kind of enjoyment to just be amongst that. And I think that that's something that I would have to speak for a lot of booktubers, is a common theme for us. I just have to speak for others, and that word jumped out at me as like it could almost be part of the booktube glossary, I think, of Wunderkammer, because I think we all kind of have one that we try to set up. So I'll just finish here by showing, like, from Wikipedia, kind of a few examples of this that I thought were cool. So here is a corner of a cabinet painted by Franz Franken II in 1636. And yeah, I'm looking at this now, and this is kind of an idea of a 17th century kind of Wunderkammer with just the odds and ends and the little statues and busts and pictures and things like that that kind of populate that area. And then there is a more modern example of a Wunderkammer, which didn't look quite as stately as that one, but here you have a modern interpretation of a Wunderkammer. And in this one, it is a hoarder's dream here. I mean, it is packed with all kinds of interesting things, not the least of which, if you look up top, there are a stack of books on either side. So I did notice that in this picture, and I thought it fit well with the, kind of the theme of a word that jumped out at me, and this picture kind of backed that up, because I've seen cabinets like this in some booktubers' backgrounds, and not in mine at the moment, unfortunately, but given the resources and given a couple more books and a couple more artifacts, I would be happy to put something like that together. I just don't know if I have the space right now. So anyway, that's kind of a walk through China, a little bit of like 4 big takeaways from me. Like I said, I would like to use these 4 bullet points as a little bit of a template going forward to discuss other books in more detail. I hope that was a little bit enjoyable, and as always, I hope it was coherent. But yeah, that's it for China by Alan Wall. I think I've, thought about it a sufficient amount now for me, so I'll put it back on the shelf, and I'll hope to do more of these with other books if there's enough material there for me to talk about. But that's it for now. Thanks to anybody who watched along with this and stuck around till the end, and I'll be back shortly with some more updates.